Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first session of this year's Becoming a Literacy Leader series, Rethinking Assessment, Using Universal Screening Data to Inform Reading Instruction. We will begin by acknowledging that we are meeting on Aboriginal land that has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples from the beginning. We acknowledge that IDA Ontario serves citizens on the traditional territories of the First Nations of Ontario, the Ojibwe Chippewa, Anishinaabe, Iroquois, Mohawk, Huron-Wendat, Attawandaron, Cree and Moose Cree, Oneida, and Algonquin peoples. We recognize and deeply appreciate their historic connection to this province. We also recognize the contributions made by Métis, Inuit, and other Indigenous peoples, both in shaping and strengthening this province and Canada as a whole. This acknowledgement reminds us of our responsibilities to our relationships and the ancestral lands on which we learn, share, and live. I'm Joanne Bertrand, and I'm on the board of directors of the Ontario branch of the International Dyslexia Association, otherwise known as IDA Ontario. We are a charitable organization run by volunteers, along with part-time administrative staff dedicated to providing information and support for people with dyslexia and their families, as well as educators. You can find more information about our organization at www.idaontario.com. We are excited this evening to welcome Una Malcolm, along with Lee Fettis, Nelly Caruso, and Kate Wynn. But before we continue, we have a surprise guest, Patricia De Geer, Chief Commissioner of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, who will be saying a word for us. She wanted to support the teachers who are attending this evening. We have 1,780 teachers signed up for this evening's event. Thank you and welcome, Patricia.
Thank you so much, Joanne, for that warm introduction, and a jolly good evening to everyone. And thanks again for inviting me into this space to talk about the right to read and early screening. As well, thank you so much, Alicia Smith and your team, for your constant support and allyship and advice to the Ontario Human Rights Commission, especially during our inquiry and now during the implementation of our recommendations. You know, I'm still blown away by the sheer number of educators across the province taking your spare time and perhaps your very last summer, the last evening of summer, to learn about the right to read. Tonight, I will say a few words about the importance of early screening. Screening is not a diagnostic tool. A screening measure is a quick and informed evidence-based test that provides information about possible reading difficulties in our children. It identifies students who are at risk for or currently experiencing reading difficulties so they can receive more instructions or immediate intervention. And it does not identify children for a special education designation or label. It is an early detection approach for the benefit of our children and our teachers. Screening helps educators better understand how to help their students, and the students receive immediate and targeted support. Universal early screening is effective and necessary to protect the rights of all our students, particularly students from many of our code-protected groups. It is an early intervention that helps decision takers around students' outcome and reduce the potential for bias. Schools can make data-informed decisions because they can compare results from common screening tools across populations. Teachers play a critical role in identifying students' learning needs. Teachers are in the best position to make that observation. Proactive screening is better than waiting to see if a student has difficulty learning to read. This wait-and-see approach to identify learning difficulties is widespread in the Ontario education system. The inquiry found that typically schools wait for students to present extreme difficulties before teachers notice or is able to refer a student for further support. Early screening identifies struggling students who are at risk and provide early and targeted intervention. As you know, students respond to intervention declines as they grow older. Earlier intervention is most effective. Screening identifies at risk young readers who are behind on fundamental reading skills and prevents them from developing later reading difficulties and dealing with associated lifelong consequences of failing to learn to read. And that is why early screening is critical for catching students before they fall behind. Schools must screen every student early, starting in kindergarten year 1, using evidence-based screening tools. The earlier schools screen students, the earlier students can receive instructions or intervention that will enable them to learn to read accurately and fluently. Currently, Ontario does not have universal systemic evidence-based early screening to identify students at risk for reading difficulties for immediate tiered intervention. Boards are using screening assessment that are either not evidence-based or have not been adequately evaluated. The notorious PPM 55 in the way it's interpreted and applied is an obstacle to universal early screening. The inquiry found that the Ministry of Education's Policy and Program Memorandum PPM 155 creates obstacles to universal screening. PPM leaves the frequency, timing, and selection of diagnostic assessments to individual teachers' professional judgment. Hence, boards cannot mandate specific screening tools. Their ability to collect data and use this data to plan and address achievement in their gaps is compromised. So we look at the right to read and we find some recommendations relevant to screening. 1, the Ministry of Education should mandate, standardize, and provide funding for twice yearly evidence-based screening for all students in kindergarten to grade 2. The Ministry of Education should require school boards to provide early tiered intervention based on screening results. The Ministry of Education should mandate data collection on the selected screening tools to improve accountability. School boards should make sure teachers receive adequate training and support to administer the selected screening tools. So in conclusion, I say the ministry has adopted the right to read inquiry and its recommendations, but we are continuing to push for change and work with our communities. We will continue to monitor and review the steps the ministry has taken and announced, and we will press forward to have the ministry and education partners implement other right to read recommendations, such as reviewing the kindergarten program and universal early screening. As I said before, the time is right to embrace the opportunity to reculture our schools, our children, with a human rights focus, and to reset how we teach students to read along the way. Thank you so much for allowing me in this space, and I hope you have a jolly good session together.
Thank you so much, Patricia. Your presence here and your message are greatly appreciated. Before we introduce Una Malcolm and our panel of teachers, we have a few housekeeping details. So today we'll be collecting your questions in the Q&A section, and Una will answer as many as she can during the question period at around 8:40. If you would like to share resources or comments, they are welcomed in the chat. And if there are many which are shared, we will create a document which we will share with you in our follow-up email after the webinar. We will be conducting a draw for 2 prizes at the end of our session. There will be 2 foundations manuals from the University of Florida's Literacy Institute. If we can advance that slide, that would be great, so we can show people. We have the illustration. Oh, yes, thank you. The documents and resources for our first session can be seen through this QR code. If you have trouble, just let us know in the chat, and we'll put a link in the chat for you. So now I'd like to introduce Una and our panel of teachers. Una is a reading science doctoral student at the University of Mount St. Joseph, and she has a master's degree in child study and education from OISE and the University of Toronto. She's a member of the Ontario College of Teachers, and she owns a clinic offering structured literacy intervention. She's also trained in several evidence-based reading intervention approaches, including Linda Mood Bell LIPS, direct instruction, and phonographics. Una is also an Acadian's reading mentor for kindergarten to grade 6 and PELI assessment measures. She's passionate about learning with and from classroom teachers as they provide structured literacy in Tier 1 classroom instruction. With research indicating that reading failure is preventable for the vast majority of students, Una is an advocate for response to intervention, multi-tiered systems of support frameworks to provide equitable access to learning opportunities for all children. Una is also co-author of Pratique Phonemique, a phonemic awareness tool for immersion, French immersion. Una will be interviewing 3 teachers who use screeners to inform their instruction. They have graciously agreed to share their strategies and knowledge with us throughout our series. You can turn on your cameras, ladies. And first, we have Kate Wynn. She's been teaching various subjects in several divisions for the past 22 years. She has been in kindergarten for the past 6 years. She is the author of several magazine articles and podcasts and has presented at conferences and webinars. She frequently provides informal mentoring to her peers. Kate has received Acadian's training for kindergarten to grade 6 and data interpretation. She's enrolled in the Introduction to Structured Literacy course, Top 10 Tools through IDA Ontario, and she has recently successfully completed, the IDA Ontario's Basics of Decoding and Spelling Instruction, which, by the way, is available through the IDA Ontario website for only $65. It's really an excellent tool for learning the basics of decoding and spelling. Next, we have Lee Fettis, a literacy coach and grade 4 French immersion teacher. She has a Master of Teaching degree from Griffith University in Australia. She also has letters training and Orton Gillingham training. She's a coach for IDA Ontario's Introduction to Structured Literacy instruction. I should specify Una is also a coach. Lee recently presented information on scopes and sequences in the Francophone and FSL classroom for our favorite FSL and Francophone structured literacy tools, a bilingual webinar for IDA Ontario. She also holds special education and FSL specialist AQs, as well as reading part 1. Our third teacher is Nelly Caruso, who has worked as a French immersion teacher since 1999. She began her career teaching at the junior level and then made a move to primary. She has worked as a homeroom teacher as well as a literacy coach, and Nelly has a master's degree in French. She has her OG classroom educator level certification and is currently in the midst of completing letters training. She's also a co-author of Pratique Phonemique, that phonemic awareness tool for immersion students. Finally, Una, the floor is yours. We can't wait to hear about how Nelly, Lee, and Kate use screeners in their classrooms to inform instruction.
Well, thank you so much, Joanne. And I too am very excited to hear about that. Our plan for today is we'll take a few moments to have a bit of content about screening, what it is, demystifying some common misconceptions, and then we'll get right into it and chat with our wonderful panel about how they plan to use screening in their classrooms this year. Now, a big thank you. We are so grateful to not only our panel, but also to our audience, recognizing again, it's one of the last few evenings of summer, and certainly thinking about teachers. It's a very busy week with classroom setup. So we are very appreciative of everybody's time today. And we are also very appreciative of the time that it took to fill out our survey with the registration for this webinar. That data is incredibly helpful for us, not only to help to make sure that we're pitching our webinars and trainings effectively to meet your needs, but also to help us in our advocacy efforts. So we thought that we'd start with just a little bit of a taste of what you were thinking and what you were saying. So great news, we noticed that nearly 84% of Ontario registrants either agreed or strongly agreed with the research and findings of the OHRC Right to Read report. So fantastic to see. When it came to thinking about and responding to how specific school boards are responding to the Right to Read report, though, things started to get a little bit more mixed. You'll notice we have a bit of a mixed bag. We've got, some who are quite cautiously optimistic about how their board is responding to it, but we do have some individuals in Ontario who are discouraged, either somewhat or very discouraged. So really interesting to see what those perspectives are across the province. And then zooming in specifically to our topic this evening of universal screening, we really wanted to get a sense of what participants and what Ontario teachers are noticing about what their boards are doing with respect to early screening. And about 26% of Ontario teachers who were surveyed reported that their boards have started universal screening. So certainly something that I'm very much looking forward to diving into this evening. So Patricia gave a really wonderful summary of the specific recommendations that the OHRC made in the Right to Read report. So I certainly will not go in depth into any of this, but I would encourage, if that's something where you're really looking to learn more about what was found and what was recommended, please take a look at the report. But in broad strokes, absolutely, universal screening was recommended for all students in kindergarten to grade 2. This screening should use valid and reliable measures that are really honing in on those essential early literacy skills that allow us to judge risk effectively. In order to make this happen, we need to be looking at funding, job-embedded training, and time to administer, score, and enter data. So again, just a very brief summary of what is recommended. And the reason this is such a key recommendation to allow for stronger reading outcomes in our province, this quote was particularly compelling for me, not only in that universal screening was recommended as not just something that is effective but necessary, but also for highlighting the groups of students who would benefit from this type of screening. We're not just thinking about children with dyslexia. We are thinking about students from racialized or Indigenous backgrounds, students from low SES backgrounds, students who are multilingual. We know that this is critical to allow them to realize the right to read. This is important because universal screening is important because it allows for stronger classroom instruction that meets the needs of students, as a stronger instructional context. It allows for early identification of potential reading difficulties that can allow for more effective and more efficient intensification of instruction. And it reduces the bias that can be inherent with referral-based systems. When we screen every student, we give every student a voice. So to put this visually in terms of why it's important, we can look at the Matthew effect. And this was coined by Dr. Keith Stanovich at the University of Toronto. And I think it's a visual representation of something that we see very much when we think about students who are struggling and what that pathway can look like for them. We know from research that reading pathways are established very early and are unfortunately incredibly stable. Students who start off as strong readers tend to remain strong readers. Students who start off as weak readers almost overwhelmingly continue to be weak readers. What changes is the gap and how different those groups are. You'll notice early on, the gap is quite small. It's easier to close. But as students get older, that gap only serves to widen, with feedback cycles of strong readers enjoying reading and weak readers not, and that further amplifying those reading profiles. We know that to be effective at improving student outcomes and allowing all students to learn to read, we need to be able to quickly and reliably identify who is at risk so we can adjust our instruction better at the beginning when that gap is very small. Screening allows us to quickly and reliably identify students early enough that we have time to do something about it. So it's really important that when we think about screening, we're framing screening in the context of instruction. It's very important to recognize that screening by itself is not going to change student outcomes. By screening all students, though, it allows us to shape the instructional context more effectively so we can provide that instruction to meet student needs and to improve student outcomes. When I think about my training in assessment has always been framed to me as a way of answering questions about students and questions about systems. We know that the instruction is the key, and we know that we need to link these questions about students to the instructional context. So Dr. Jan Hasbrook has really beautifully distilled down many different questions that we can ask when we're thinking about teaching reading into 3 main ones. Who needs support? What should that support be? And is that support working? So today, with our focus on screening, we really are honing in on that first question. Who needs support? We need a valid, brief, easy, effective way of identifying very quickly who needs support, so we have time enough to do something about it. When we talk about screening, though, it's important to note that screening is very different from diagnostic assessment, like Chief Commissioner Daguerre mentioned. They serve two different purposes. They answer two different kinds of questions. Screening allows us to know who is at risk. Diagnostic assessment allows us to know what skills do students have, what skills do students need to be taught. They are two very different types of questions, and the tools that work well for one don't tend to work well for the other. So there are some very clear specific differences between these. This is a cheat sheet. It's linked in the Padlet. We've put many wonderful resources in the Padlet. So if you're interested in taking a look at this, it's linked for you. And there's also a video by Dr. Stephanie Stoller, again, highlighting those differences between those types of tools, what they're used for, and what that looks like. So we've talked about why screening is important. Let's now dive into what that actually looks like and what we might use to screen our students in the classroom. I will walk through these specific characteristics. We've talked about how screening needs to happen a couple times a year with all students, universal, it's in the name, but what does that actually look like in terms of the tools that we need to select to make that happen? So we know that screening needs to be fast, reliable, and valid. It needs to focus on indicators of essentially early literacy skills, and it needs to be predictive. So when we say fast, we mean fast. What I've given here is a screenshot of two commonly used screening tools. We've got Acadian and we've got DIBELS 8. And you'll notice that while it does vary based on the grade level and based on the particular point of year, because that determines which specific subtests and measures are used, we're looking at less than 10 minutes per student. In fact, as fast as 2 or 3 minutes per student. We know if we're going to be screening every child in the classroom, this can't be a slow, drawn-out process that takes half an hour. We need to make sure we can get in, get our reliable data quickly, and get out so we can provide the instruction. We can't waste instructional time. We know that we need screeners to be reliable and valid. These are statistical terms that essentially tell us how much we can trust the data. When we think about how reliable a screener is, we're thinking about how consistent it is. If we test a child multiple times, do we get similar scores? If multiple teachers are using the same measure, do they get similar scores? When we think about validity and whether tests are valid, we're thinking about, is it measuring what we want to measure? Is it measuring that construct that we are seeking to learn more about? So we know that screeners need to be reliable and valid. Often this comes from published screeners with validity and research data supporting it. This is not something that can usually happen with board created or DIY screeners. We know that we need screeners to be indicators of early reading skills. We know, again, we want it to be brief and efficient. We can't test every single phonics pattern that we would want to know if a child knows. We only want to take a tiny little sample. We want an indicator. An indicator, you can think about it as like a quick, easy, fast temperature check. It's a quick and easy way of noticing quite easily if there's a problem. It doesn't necessarily tell us everything we need to know about health, but it tells us right off the bat if there's an alarm bell. Screening is like this. We need to just have an indicator to quickly tell who is at risk. We also want to make sure the screeners we choose allow us to predict who is on track and who is not on track and therefore needs more support or needs adjustment of the instructional context. Nadine Gabb said it beautifully. She said that screening is the closest thing we can get to a crystal ball. We know that a lot of the screeners that are developed were developed with longitudinal outcome data. What that means is that a group of students were followed by researchers over time. The students who ended up being strong readers could be, their scores from earlier on could be analyzed. So that way we know where we want students to get if they stand a good chance of being a strong reader in the future. We know that this type of screening allows us to assess risk, oftentimes even before we've started to teach students to read. This way we are avoiding the wait to fail model. Now, I know that everybody is probably thinking, okay, great, but what tools do we use? And as a structured literacy teacher, I rely a lot on examples and non-examples to explicitly teach. So I'm going to give you some non-examples and then I'll give you some examples. These are very commonly used tools within an early reading program. You can see there's one for phonemic awareness and one for phonics and decoding. These play a very important role in early reading instruction. They do not, however, allow us to answer the question, who is at risk? We don't have benchmarks. There's no predictive value. There's no validity or reliability data with these. These are very important. They allow us to know what skills we need to teach, but unfortunately, they do not allow us to answer that question that we needed answering for screening, who is at risk. Other commonly used assessment tools in early screening or in early reading programs are often running record based, such as the ones we've indicated on the screen here. Unfortunately, these too cannot be used for screening. There's a broader issue in that many of these tools were created under a whole language or balanced literacy philosophy, in that errors are analyzed based on queuing systems. But then there are also methodological issues related to how effectively they are able to predict student performance. So we've linked to some research in the Padlet if you're interested in learning more. But one study that I found particularly interesting found that the Fontes and Pinnell benchmark assessment system was 54% predictive of future reading outcomes for students in grade 2 and grade 3. So as far as I'm concerned, that's a lot like just flipping a coin in terms of being able to validly and reliably assess who is on track and who needs more support. So again, a bit of a non-example here. Now, we'll chat more about specific tools and what tools our panelists will be using, but I did want to clarify some vocabulary. You may see people referring to something called Cbms, or curriculum-based measures. Now, these were pioneered by Dr. Standino, and they are, you can see we've provided some examples there of commonly used Cbms. In a nutshell, these measures are valid and reliable. They are quick and easy to administer and score. They are easy to understand for a variety of stakeholders, and they are effective, inexpensive, and just generally quite easy to integrate within the classroom environment. So something to think about. But before we transition to diving in with our panel, I think it's worth pulling back a little bit and recognizing the parallels in terms of how we're thinking about screening to how we're thinking about instruction. Just like sometimes it takes a fair amount of work to shift to a structured literacy-based model for instruction, I think it's similar to thinking about screening. This type of work often involves building knowledge, reevaluating and reexamining past practices, maybe looking into new resources or tools. And it can be quite challenging to do that. And it can be very challenging if you're the only one doing that without support. So I think that's, for me, why I'm especially grateful to our wonderful teachers for opening up their classrooms, donating their time, and really helping to show how they will be doing that this year so we can all learn from them. So with that being said, I will pull back in a few minutes and we will start chatting with our teachers. And my first question for this evening really zooms into, why? Why is this something you're considering doing? Why are you choosing to screen students? How is this different from how you used to assess student reading? So with that, I will pull us back. There we go. And I will, if you guys can just pop your cameras on so everybody could see you, your wonderful faces. I will start off. Nelly, why are you choosing to screen and how is this different from what you've done before? Oh, Nelly, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I was just saying hello. So I've actually realized that, like so many other teachers that are embarking on this science of reading and universal screening journey, I actually came to this decision to implement universal screening in my class because of a personal connection. So I had actually learned about universal screening tools after using a particular tool to assess my own daughter. And so in going through the training process and gaining all of the background knowledge and understanding how valuable these tools are, I walked away thinking there is no way I could not possibly do this with the students in my classroom. So yes, when I understood that how significantly this could impact outcomes for students in terms of, future reading ability, I thought, imagine finding out right away based on objective, non-biased data, who's at risk and being able to target instruction and intervene right away and hit the ground running. So for me, it was a bit of a no-brainer. Traditionally in the past, I had used running records and other similar assessments to, assess my kids in reading, my students. And so, we all know what that looks like, kind of going up some levels, down some levels. It was quite time consuming, and it always left me kind of feeling like something wasn't quite right or something was missing. And it did take quite a bit of instructional time. And at the end, never quite gave me information that I felt was specific enough to help me really hone in and target needs. So universal screening has been a game changer for me. I actually piloted it last year with my class. So I am not an expert and still learning, but have gone through the process of screening the students 3 times last year. And I just love them because they're fast. And the data that I get at the end is so powerful, and I can trust it. And it really, as you said, I really feel that it's the voice for my students. Many students who I think without using these tools could very easily be missed or not caught until much later, at which point, as you just showed us with the Matthew effect, it's so much harder to intervene the later we catch them. So I'm excited to get going again this year, because I feel like it's making me a much more effective teacher in terms of being able to find out who's at risk, address the needs, and tailor the instruction to meet those needs. Yeah.
Fantastic. I think it's so important and exciting to think about how there are a lot of teachers who do have a personal connection to somebody, a friend, a family member with reading difficulties. And I think that often is the spark plug for a lot of people for really leaning into the structured literacy piece. Lee, can you jump in? Anything to add? Why are you screening, and how does this vary from how you previously have assessed?
Absolutely. So I'm screening for many of the same reasons as Nelly. It really does help us identify incredibly quickly who might need further investigation or like sort of a deeper dive and a look into them. And then just as quickly provide that support. So I'm not spending the first month and a half trying to figure out, I think about, we used to place students on triangles. So which tier were they red, yellow, or green? And this allows me to do that very objectively right away. So that's a quick thing, quick to do, quick to start supporting, quick to check if my interventions are working. I mean, that's the other big piece, right? Through progress monitoring, I'm able to see, not at the end of the year and not even necessarily at the midpoint, I'm able to identify that quite quickly, which is a remarkable feeling. In the past, I also use running records. And I think when I compare that to this, and I was sort of reflecting on that today, I just see a little note that I jotted down. 10 years ago, I held a similar position. So I am half grade 4 French immersion, and I'm going to be doing half early reading. And 10 years ago, I held a position that was quite similar, half special education and early reading. And I feel so much more confident already that I'll be able to help figure out which students need that extra support or who might be at risk, and then check very quickly. I remember feeling in the past, all those years ago, that I wasn't really sure, like, is this working? Like, how can I tell? And so I feel just so confident now that I'll have a much clearer picture of who needs that help and whether or not what I'm doing is on track with getting to where we need them to be. I'm also choosing to do this. I'm quite fortunate. We have a small French immersion inquiry group. And so over Christmas last year, a small group of us in our board were trained in Equitable. So I use Equitable mostly with my students. And so a number of us, a small group of us, were trained. And so we are actually working together to sort of roll this out and see how it goes within our board. So I'm lucky that way as well.
I think what was so interesting with what you said, Lee, and I think about transitioning from you who teaches grade 4. I know you've got, an early reading adventure this year as well. But when I think about what you're mentioning about how do you know whether your intervention is working, thinking especially about those students who you have in grade 4, knowing that I'm guessing we don't want them to have to wait another 4 months to know whether the support is working. We need to know sooner so we can adjust it. They don't have the time to wait. And I'll throw it back to Kate, our kindergarten teacher of the group. Kate, tell us about screening. How come?
Well, I mean, like the other two ladies, I want the best available data, right? To know who's at risk, to know what's going on, and to how to best program and tailor my instruction, my small group work. In terms of kindergarten in the past, I have used a couple of your non-example things that you put there. And so something like the phonological phonemic awareness assessment that you showed, you can get some information from that, but it's not that whole research base, all of the data that actually can tell you if a child is at risk. I mean, I could have some information, but I don't know, is that good for kindergarten? Like, is that number right? Are they at risk? Is that bad? So that's why I went looking for something else. And also, of course, the running records. And at kindergarten, when you have that binder of those little books for running records, they are predictable and they are, you know, pattern based. You're not really learning anything in terms of the skill of the child. So, you know, in terms of what they've learned, any kind of scope and sequence, and then what you need to do next. So I knew those ones weren't working for me anymore. And last year I did switch to, like in the spring, I switched to a different one, a research-based one with benchmarks. We will talk about it a bit more later, and I will just never go back. Like Nelly said, game changer.
Now, Kate, I know because you and I have chatted about it a little bit. I know what you've been saying before, but I was just wondering, you know, you had said that you piloted this screening last spring. How did that, you know, was it something that you found that it informed your instruction last year? Was it something where you found that you were making adjustments based on what your screening data told you when you did that middle of year screening?
Oh, it changed everything. It totally did. And I know maybe we'll get to talking about that a little bit more later in terms of what I do with my data. I can kind of get in a little bit to what I did with the data in the spring, but it was amazing to have that, you know, kind of the class list with the red for the below benchmark, and then the sort of red for well below, and then you've got your yellow for below and your green for when they're at benchmark, and to kind of group kids and see what's going on. It was, it's just so amazing to have that information. It just felt so empowering to feel like, okay, I actually know what they need and what to do. I'm not guessing here. So it was fantastic.
So it sounds like we've got 3 who are keen to screen again this year. Is there anything that we're flexible, we're low key this evening. If there's anything that you would like to jump in and play off each other, please feel free to jump in and comment, but I'm happy to move on to another question. But I also want to make sure that I'm honoring your opportunity to chat or contribute if there's anything else you want to touch base on for this question. Okay, I will show you what I've got next. Let's see, there we go. Okay, so again, we are so grateful for this data that we've gathered within the registration. We had chatted earlier with that idea that about 26% of Ontario participants mentioned that their boards had started universal screening programs. Now, when we actually dug in a little bit deeper and asked, okay, what tools are being used for that? Interestingly, almost 60% of participants responded that their boards were using tools or screeners that the boards had developed themselves. So I know this from conversations with our 3 teachers in terms of getting ready for this evening, that actually that's not an approach that any of the 3 will be using. What I would love to chat about now is to dive into what specific tool, do you have a tool that you're planning to use? What sort of factors did you consider when you were choosing it? And also, I would love to chat about that idea of how that screening looks different depending on what grade level you're teaching, knowing that we're really wanting to focus in on those essential literacy skills and what we would want to measure and get indicators of changes as students develop and grow. Again, knowing we've got a kindergarten teacher, a grade 2 teacher, and a grade 4 teacher. So I will pull us back. And Kate, I will have you jump in. Tell us about the tool you're choosing and tell us how that decision came about for you.
So I'm going to continue using Acadians, which is what I started using in the spring. I chose it last year based on recommendations from educators I trust, including you, Una, and also, different presenters I saw in PD sessions, people whose expertise I thought, again, the trust was there, right? But I thought it would be a good tool to try. I was really grateful that my board, PDNC, supported my training in the essential workshop and in the data interpretation workshop, but you don't have to do the training to use their free online tools. I just want to make sure everybody knows that too. So now in Ontario, in case anybody's not from Ontario, kindergarten is a 2-year program here. So in the year 1, we've got the kids who are 4 or turning 4. And then in year 2, we have the kids who are 5 or turning 5. So I am using the K screener, which is more kind of year 2 benchmark based. There is a pre-K tool from Acadians. It's called Pelly, and it's got a storybook, and that's kind of what you do with the child to kind of pull out the information that you need. That is something that does have to be purchased. So I decided I'm going to just stick with the free tools for now. I am going to still do screen my year 1s, but keeping in mind that the benchmarks are more for the year 2 age. However, they are getting the same instruction all year long. So I'm just going to just sort of see how that part goes. The fall screening, they estimate that it takes 3 minutes because there are 2 60-second tests that you do and then a little bit of time for instruction. So you do a letter naming fluency test where you just have a sheet of letters and the child just names any letters that they can. There's no actual benchmark number for this, but we do know that that can be a real predictive factor for kids in terms of risk down the line. So that is one of the subtests. The only other thing you do in fall with kindergarten is a first sound fluency subtest where you give a word like kid, and what's the first sound you hear in that word? You want them to say k. If they say k, they get the full 2 points. If they say ki, they get 1 point because they're getting that there's segmentation happening, but they're not getting their full points. That's it. That's all you do with kindergarten. So I think there's a lot of misunderstandings out there in terms of, the stress we're putting on these poor babies with these, screeners. And it's not like that at all. And my experience has been they love the one-to-one attention. So, and also there's a discontinue rule. So, I mean, if you have a child and, you get through the whole first row and they don't know anything, then that's fine. You discontinue. You're not, subjecting a child to feeling like they don't know anything. You just move on. So, I mean, I've only had positive experiences. When you get to the middle of the year, they add phoneme segmentation fluency. So you say the word and they're supposed to sound it all out, like k, give you all 3 of the sounds. And then also they add in the nonsense word fluency subtest. So they have a list of nonsense words like MIP, for example, and the children are supposed to decode that word. And they use nonsense words because it's, you can probably assume that the child has not already learned to read that word. It's not orthographically mapped to the brain yet. So you're actually seeing their decoding skills in action in that moment. So at one part of the year, there's 4, so 4 minutes. And then at the end of the year, they drop the first sound fluency. So you're back down to 3 minutes, and that's it. So that's how we will be starting things off this fall.
Well, I'm looking forward to hearing more about how that progresses for you. And it is true, thinking about it, putting that in such concrete terms that for kindergarten students, we're looking at 3 or 4 minutes, I think is that concrete time measure really hits home that idea if we're looking for something that's really brief and efficient to allow for instruction. Nelly, we'll go chronologically. So if you don't mind jumping in as grade 2, what will that look like for you in grade 2 French immersion?
Okay, so I'm also using a tool called Equitable, which Lee mentioned at the very start. I've chosen it mainly because it's to my knowledge, it's the only French universal screening tool out there. And it happens to be, the Equitable measures happen to be parallel measures to the Acadian's K-6 measures. So because I had already had my K-6 training, as well as my data interpretation training, then I found out there was a French tool. So Acadians was originally Dibbles, and then it was called Dibbles next, and it was renamed to Acadians. And another factor that was important for me in choosing it is the fact that Acadians has a really strong track record of research behind it. So that was really important. And I should also mention that the Equitable measures, they do have benchmarks for both French second language, so French immersion students, as well as French first language populations. Just one thing I wanted to add to that is that Equitable is still considered an early release project, which means it's not yet published. They're still in the process of collecting data to inform the creation of their benchmarks. So there are not benchmarks for every single grade level for every measure, but regardless, the data is so informative and so powerful. And what they do have are, where there are gaps in the benchmarks, what they do have for every grade level are local norms that they have established, which are still really valuable in assessing risk and supporting groupings, skill groupings for working with kids and setting instructional goals. So in grade 2, the 2 measures that are given are the nonsense word reading that Kate just explained. So it's similar in French. They're reading nonsense words to assess their ability to blend sounds together and decode words that are not in their oral vocabulary. And then that is timed at 1 minute. And there's also an oral reading fluency measure. So that looks similar to a running record, except that it is timed at 1 minute and scored and administered a little bit differently. And then attached to that oral reading fluency assessment, there is a 1 minute oral retell that follows it. And I also just wanted to elaborate on the fact that because they are parallel measures, so the English measures and the French measures are scored and administered in the same way. Once you have French training and know how to use the Equitable measures, occasionally where I've wanted to just have a fuller picture on a student, or a student that perhaps I had a little bit of confusion about or wasn't quite sure what was happening, I could also, because they are free PDF downloads, administer the screening in English as well, just to give a more complete picture of a student's profile to see exactly what's happening in the other language. So I just thought that's an important piece to be aware of.
Fantastic. And that is a really important point, recognizing that idea that we are aware from research about the cross-linguistic transfer of essential early literacy skills. And that does add additional nuance in terms of English screening as well for French immersion students. Our last, I will pivot it to Lee, who can jump in with the grade 4 perspective on screening. What have you chosen? I think we all have an idea of what you've chosen, but I would love it if you could elaborate on what that will look like for you this year.
Absolutely. So as Nelly is, I'm also using Equitable. And in grade 4, we use the Facilité en lecture orale, which is the oral reading fluency. And in doing that, it is the 1 minute reading sample. And Acadians and Equitable both have 3 different passages. And I've really appreciated that, because in the past I did a different measure and it was just 1. And so having the 3 passages has really allowed me to see, take the median of the 3, just how much that accounts for, knowledge about material, just settling into the process. And so it really has allowed, I think, just a sort of more reliable information. And so in doing the oral reading fluency, Facilité en lecture orale, we look at accuracy and words correct per minute. And it's quite neat, because then you can actually identify what it is that that means, like what is leading to those, right? And so do they know the sounds and just need a bit more practice, or do you actually have to back that up quite a bit? And so having that tool available to us has just allowed me to figure out, again, rapidly what it is I need to look further at or to do with my kiddos. I want to piggyback on what Kate said, which is what a positive experience this is for students. And so it is quite funny. So as I've mentioned, it's 3 times 1 minute passages along with the retell, which Nelly mentioned. But after I'm finished with students, they're often asking, like, Madame, do I get to read with you again? And I'll say, well, friends, you've already done yours, but we will do this again. And so in the past, last year, I did it in both English and French, and they are just so excited to come, as you said, spend that one-on-one time. But I think also see their improvements. I mean, they can see as the year progresses that they are improving. And sometimes that they, I don't tell them, with the data, just as I wouldn't necessarily, although sometimes I do tell them the data. I've had students that go from reading 8 words correct per minute up to 40 words correct per minute. And so that is such a confidence booster, and it really does give feedback on all of their hard work. And so I think that's just such great information, but it is so positive. I think the other piece to consider is that with our younger kiddos, Nelly, you mentioned that you sometimes use the Acadian Screeners, and that's a really great consideration, I think, for our French immersion begins in grade 1. And so while we haven't identified which screeners we'll use, we're going to be screening our grade 1s, I think, middle to end year using Equitable. At the beginning, that just wouldn't be appropriate. So start of year grade 1, because they won't have those oral skills and they won't have had enough instruction in French. And so just an awareness that there is a time, again, to be screening them in their first language or in English. And so there's just so many different possibilities to account for, again, finding which students of ours could be at risk.
There is so much I want to pull out of all three of those answers, because I think you hit on some really, really important points. I think that idea of doing the 3 probes is a really interesting one that I'd like to just echo back. That idea that for some screeners, if they are doing a 1-minute measure, it's often 3 1-minute measures with different materials, knowing that then we can take that median score to sort of buffer and protect against differences with background knowledge or content knowledge or vocabulary, knowing that we have a bit more reliability there. But I think what I would love to sort of share back, knowing that 2 of you sort of reported a really positive student experience with screening, I would love to sort of ask you what you think in terms of there are people who express concern that these are timed measures, knowing that, Kate, you had mentioned, it's first sound fluency and then eventually nonsense word fluency, knowing that it's a 1 minute and knowing that 1 minute sort of measure carries all the way up through the grade levels. Is it something where you find that the timing can be challenging? We can chat about the rationale for why it's timed, but I would love it just to hear your perspective in terms of if you notice any timing issues or if that seems to be not an issue on your end. Whoever wants to jump in can go ahead.
I'll jump in because I actually want to say that I've had the exact same positive experience. So no, I haven't found the timing of 1 minute to be stressful for the children at all. And actually, it's something I had jotted down to say it's been a positive experience that they look forward to doing. And as Lee mentioned, even just showing them without much explanation how their 3 numbers, whether that's the accuracy score, the number of words correct per minute, jumped from, I'll say, look at the beginning of the year and look at the middle of the year, and then look how high the number is at the end of the year. That in and of itself is so motivating for kids because they realize they can. And I think it plays a big role in terms of their motivation and their engagement. Once they realize that they become motivated because they realize they can actually read. And so that in and of itself is motivating. So I just wanted to say that.
I saw somebody type in the chat box, and it's what I would say as well. So I have I have these all over the place by little timers. And I tell the kids up front, I say, it's just going to be a 1 minute sample. You're going to read as you would speak to me. You're not to go faster, don't go slower, just to read to me as you would read. And after 1 minute, my clock will beep and we'll repeat this a few more times. And I think they kind of like that they know what to expect, right? With a running record, sometimes it could go on and especially as you try to find which level are they at, and so there really is that comfort piece in knowing what the process is going to look like, and especially after the first one, and especially if they've seen peers doing it. So you can really settle into a routine where it just happens very comfortably.
I think that's a really interesting point too. And I know when I've done screening in the past, there are tricks, certainly there are considerations for students where we know they might be a bit nervous about it. There are quiet beep timers where that way it might vibrate, or that way they're not hearing this blaring alarm. But certainly there are considerations for how to frame that for students. And then also knowing the research end of it, that we know we are doing these measures so we can have a proxy or an indicator of comprehension. And in order for kids to comprehend, they need to be fluent and automatic with both lexical and sublexical skills. We need these skills to be automatic if students are able to comprehend. If they're not automatic, they are burning their cognitive resources trying to actually decode in this belabored way. So we do need to have an indicator of fluency and automaticity. But no, it looks, Lee, jump in, go ahead if you
yeah,
in.
I think you hit it right there. I think again that being aware of the time for us, not for the students, but when you do different reading assessments, you aren't aware of how long it might have taken them to read a page or a sentence or even a word. And so this just keeps in your mind that awareness of time, that, you haven't just spent half an hour reading a couple of pages. And so I really value that piece in addition to all the other information.
Actually, it just makes me think of one last thing that was intimidating for me when I started. So I always like to share that it's important to keep in mind when and if you do start on this journey of universal screening, that with those, I'm sure you'll agree, Lee, with those ORF passages that the students are expected to read in 1 minute, when you first look at them, you think, oh my gosh, there's no way, this is so long and so difficult. And so what I think we need to remember is that they're not expected to read the entire passage in a minute, and that the passages, the level of difficulty of the passages from the beginning to middle to end of your screening doesn't change. What changes is the benchmark or the expectation. So just not to be afraid when you first look at some of those measures.
Right, Nelly, and I think for us to say that to those students as well, right? I mean, I say that it's very unlikely that you'll read all of this, and just so that they don't feel that they have to rush through, and if they haven't, they feel terribly about it.
I sometimes joke to students that I actually don't know what happens at the end of the story, because I've never actually heard anybody read that far. I hear a whole lot of the beginnings of a lot of these passages, and I don't know what happens at the end of it. And that kind of gets a bit of a giggle and helps to sort of settle in any little concerns. But no, it's an interesting consideration, again, knowing that a lot of these CBMs are timed, and that is, again, a bit of a difference for how we may have been doing things before. Okay, well, let me pull you back and jump into our third big question. Again, hoping we can make sure that we have lots of time. I see there's some Q&As popping up in Zoom, so we want to make sure we honor that and have time for that. But I'd like just to switch gears to our last point of, this is coming up. I mean, we're looking at back to school next week. I had popped in some data here in terms of those people who reported that their boards were doing a universal screening program. The great news is that more than 56% of participants reported that they did receive training on those measures. Now, I know from my conversations with you that all three of you have received training on the tools that you will be using. So I would love to chat about sort of what preparation you've already done in terms of training, and certainly you've piloted it. But what are the actual logistics of screening? How will you screen your students? When will you screen your students? Do you have any preliminary plans about what you'll do with your data? What will this look like for you in the next month or so? And I will pull you back. And Lee, do you mind starting us off with this one?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And so in preparing to screen, I'm obviously reviewing everything. I mean, sometimes in my mind, I get mixed up between Equitable and Acadian. So I'm sort of refamiliarizing myself with the assessment, or pardon me, the screening and the tool that I'll be using. I'm also reviewing information that I have on students, so as we bridge with their previous teachers. And sometimes that helps me to determine the order in which I'll screen my children. So kids who might just need a little bit more time getting used to speaking French again. I might screen some of students who have been passed along as possibly being a little bit more stronger or more comfortable even. And so it will just help me determine in my mind maybe the order in which I'll screen. I'm also going to practice on my grade 5 going into grade 5 son, just to make sure that I'm feeling comfortable again. And as Nelly, you mentioned, it's valuable information on our own people as well. And so I have my little guinea pig there. I'm preparing materials. And so I'm just making sure that I have the booklets ready to go, getting access again to the different programs, because I might want to run them off. Sometimes they do update, I believe, as well. And so making sure I have the most current version of all of these. I'm reviewing the prompts, because there is a very specific set of prompts within each tool. And also the discontinue rules, or when, I might not do a retell. And so when we do the oral retell, that is based on them reading a certain number of words and with our own judgment. And so I'm just reviewing all of those so that I'm, not fumbling around to the best of my ability once I get going. When will I screen my students? So we spoke about this a little bit earlier. And so Acadians does recommend that we wait a little bit, and just to allow students to, settle back in after holidays, after big breaks, and to settle into a bit of a routine again. And so I will not screen next week. I'll probably start the following week, our second full week of school. And I think that's a really important thing in second language, because these kiddos haven't necessarily spoken a lot, if any, French. I mean, my son's in immersion and I teach immersion, and we've not spoken a lot of French. And so I know they'll need that time just to become familiar with understanding instructions again and becoming comfortable. So I will wait until that second week. And I expect to be done within that week. I mean, it really is quite rapid. And so I will screen my grade 4 French immersion students within that second week. And I will do that just throughout the day. Like, I mean, we've talked about how easy it is. And so you can do a few students every day, screen a few students every day. And it really isn't, if I have 10 minutes, I can screen, one student and even get started on my second student. So it is just so much faster in that way. I love that you asked what I plan to do with the information, because I think all three of us have taken the data interpretation workshop, and that was a game changer for me. And I think, Nelly, you had said it was your favorite, and now I see why. And so with that information, and actually, I'm going to just back up 1 second. The other thing I'm going to do, because Nelly, you reminded this, there aren't benchmarks for grades 3 and 4 French immersion yet, because as we know in Equitable, it is not, it's just in the first release. And so it's not published yet. And so I had forgotten, or I don't even know if I knew that there are local norms. So I'm going to find those. But as you said, even without that, you can see within the numbers sort of what's the high, the low, and where the bulk of your students are. And so I would like to have local benchmarks, but I need to look at that because I didn't know such a thing existed. So thank you. So what I plan to do with the information is it will allow me to determine some groupings. And that was the greatest thing about taking that data interpretation workshop, is it allows you to sort of narrow down on a couple of key indicators and think about some initial grouping based on that. So what it is your students are doing well, where they might be at risk, and allow you to work with that. So to make some groups. And the other piece that I really like is it's going to allow me to make partnerships and groups for things like some of the interventions I want to do. Kate, I know you've talked about this one, partner reading. And so partner reading following a very specific protocol as a means of building fluency. Well, I do that based on my findings in Equitable, so the fluency and the accuracy. It allows me to arrange partnerships that will work well so that students benefit from, and the intervention works appropriately for them. And I think that looks like everything. Oh, the other thing is it helps me to determine what kind of support the students might need. So if they'll need, core within the classroom support, if I'll need to be strategic. So is there something specific I need to look at based on what I found in the screening, and if they'll need intensive support. And so thinking about dose and frequency of how often I'll be working with them.
That was fantastic. And I think that you're probably hitting, Lee, on a lot of points that Nelly and Kate are probably going to jump in on. But Kate, I'll pass it over to you. Tell us about what you've done and what this will look like for you over the next little stretch.
So I've talked already about my training and starting the screening last year. So to get ready for this fall, I printed off the kindergarten booklet, and this benchmark assessment booklet is the one that does you for the whole year. It takes you through your beginning, middle, and end of year screening. So I've got that one photocopied, ready to go for everybody. I'm planning to screen my year 2s probably into the 2nd or 3rd week of school, maybe my year 1s right after that. We'll just see. But the year 2s were already with me last year, so I'm not really worried about too long of a settling in period or anything. One thing I am doing, because First Sound Fluency is one of the first subtasks, we have our Welcome to Kindergarten coming up on Tuesday, and in their Welcome to Kindergarten bags, they're getting a little First Sound Fluency dice activity, along with a die or a number cube. So, and I'll instruct the parents so that they understand what they're doing, why they're working on that skill, so the child can just roll the number cube. And if they get a 3, well, the first thing is octopus. So we want them to say, all right. And so they'll just be able to work on that at home. That's a really easy one for parents too. When you tell them, like, we don't need any letters or any spelling or anything, all we want is the first sound. To do it, I'll just pull 1-to-1. I mean, I'm very lucky. I've got a registered early childhood educator partner, and and so we spell each other off for things. And so while he is doing other things with the kids, like he's supervising or he's leading a lesson or whatever, I will have that time to pull. And also during playtime. And I know I've heard people say, well, does that give kids the wrong impression about play, that you're pulling them to do that? Everything's just so flexible and so fluid. Like, our kids really get used to, oh, Mrs. Wynn needs me to go read her, and now I'm going back to play. It's honestly, it's not a big deal. I've got my color-coded list from last year, so I'm looking forward to having all of that data to work with and to inform, small group instruction and what we need to do with kids. And remember, you don't have to divide kids into equal groups and they're all going to get the same amount of time and you're going to ring a bell and everybody's going to go to the next table. Like sometimes I'm pulling one kid by themselves and then I'm pulling a little group of 3 that needs the same thing, but then the next is a group of 4 that needs the same thing. It's all just really, really flexible as you go. If a large percentage of kids need the same thing, then you also get to see if it's a tier 1, like in terms of the whole class instruction, maybe something that you could, work on a little bit more with the whole class as well, right? If there's a big number of kids that need something. I'll focus more on the year 2s who aren't at benchmark in the fall, knowing that the year 1s still have a whole other year with me next year. So my goal will really be at the start just to focus on the year 2s who need a little bit of extra help. You can get progress monitoring tools to, track the progress and even graph it and chart it and all of that stuff. Something I use just for working with kids, like a little, this is a phonemic awareness box, matches sound. And so there are all these little mats with a picture. So here's a net and they have to find all the toys that start with N. So they find the nose, nose, that starts with N, and they put it on there. So it's, again, you're not pulling kids to do all these terribly taxing academic tasks, like they're finding toys and putting them on the mats, and that's still building those pre-reading skills that we want them to have. Just an example of one student last year, I only had one who was below benchmark for the phoneme segmentation fluency, and worked with that child for 2 weeks. I had a little paper parking lot with little Hot Wheels that the child would drive in as they segmented, and I got mom on board to help do some of that at home too. In 2 weeks, that child went from the below benchmark, not just to at benchmark, but to the above benchmark category with a 2-week couple of minute a day intervention. And I know a lot of times too, as teachers, we feel like I've got good instincts and I know what my kids need and I know, who's behind and things like that. And I think that way about myself too. However, here's one example. I never would have known that was a deficit for that child at that time if I didn't have this data, because the things he was doing in terms of reading the Equitable books and participating in the lessons and all of that, I would have thought, yeah, that child is on track and it's fine. So that's where it's just so amazing to have these little tiny pieces that can really help. If nonsense word fluency happens to be an area you want to work on, remember, you don't have to use nonsense words to work on that. That just means you want to work on that decoding, right? Your letter sound correspondences, the blending piece of the reading. And also, I just want to take advantage of any help that I can get. I know in the spring we had a university student there who was a tutor, and we got her for a period a day in each class. And so I was really, really strategic about who I was progress monitoring and where they were and what they were working on. So, I mean, if you have any of that, those options coming in, tutors in the school are great when we kind of see what's going on and have some control over that tutoring process. And, like a parent volunteer, if any of that is kind of back up post-COVID this year, you can kind of figure out the best ways to maximize the help that you have. And remembering too that when you're doing some of the small group or one-on-one stuff, everybody's going to still get your tier 1 structured literacy program. And this is just that extra little bit that you're giving them just to get them up to speed to be where we want them to be, so that we can hope that they'll be successful in reading moving forward.
Kate, there's so much of that I want to bottle up and save for week 2 in terms of flexible groupings and whole class interventions. But I'm going to quickly pass it to Nelly because we've just got a few minutes. I want to make sure that we have plenty of time. It looks like there's some Q&As popping up. So Nelly, chat about what this will look like for you in the next little stretch, and then we'll open it back up to Joanne.
Okay, I'll try to be as brief as possible since Lee and Kate have pretty much touched on everything. So I just wanted to back up a little bit and say, in order to prepare to administer the screeners, yes, of course. So what does the training look like for maybe a lot of people that are on this call that who this is completely new to? It looks like watching a series of videos that takes a few hours with practice embedded while you're watching those videos, and then a quiz at the end. And so getting into some of the details, yes, preparing the materials, which really doesn't take that long. My grade partner and I did it today, actually. And just to show you that the French booklets look exactly the same as the English booklets, it took about 15 minutes to prepare the materials. And then organizing, when are you going to do the screening? What are all the other students going to be doing? And thinking about some potentially creative solutions to what that might look like. So Kate was talking about using maybe parent volunteers or older students that might be able to either help supervise or help with materials or grab students as runners. Just how can we make this work as quickly and efficiently as possible? But and we're also planning to start the second full week of school, as Lee mentioned. So my grade partner and I have made the choice to do this together. She's embarking on the journey with me. And we also figure we can have all the kids screened in a 5-day period, because you can do in a 40-minute period, 3 to 4 students. And even if at minimum you're using 1 period a day, that's roughly a class of 20 students over 5 days. And that's bare minimum. So it is quite quick. And then there's a minute or two of scoring once you've done it, once you're finished administering with each student. And for EDAPEL especially, we enter the data into the data management system, which is also seamless and easy to use and not time consuming. And then you have all these beautiful graphs and visuals available to you that help you see really quickly at a glance what's happening, as well as what's changing over time. Are things moving in the right direction? And they're not always moving in the right direction, but when we see that, we can intervene and adjust instruction. And so all of this, I just reiterate everything that Lee and Kim said about what to do with the data, because of course, at the end of the day, there's no point in collecting all this data if we aren't going to do anything with it. I'm thinking of Anita Archer, who always says the magic is in the instructions. So we use that data to, what are we going to do with it to meet the needs of the kids? And Una, there are some really fantastic grouping worksheets that are available to really help teachers or support teachers in starting to analyze data and go through a problem solving, non-intimidating work. Can we link to those in the Padlet, actually?
Thank you. Those are in the Padlet. Kate had, and that is a beautiful point to end on, right? That idea of why are we screening if we're not doing it for instruction? Perfect spot to end on. Yes, the grouping worksheets. There are grouping worksheets we put in the Padlet for Dibbles 8 and for Acadians. So those are really fantastic in terms of thinking about how to shift groupings for small groups. And that will certainly be something we'll dive into in the next webinar, that idea about how to use the data and what that looks like. Joanne, would you like to jump in with some questions that have popped up throughout?
Absolutely. There are so many. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, everyone, for these questions. They're very rich, and we are going to ask as many as we can. Here's one. How would you recommend supporting students who have emerging English skills, English as an additional language, particularly with the timed screeners? Are you aware of any screeners that would be more equitable for these students?
That is a fantastic question, and thank you for leading with that one. So I know we'll have enough time to fully address that. I would say first and foremost, we need to be mindful of normal, typical linguistic variation. Many of the screeners do have considerations printed in their administration manuals about not penalizing typical linguistic variation that is typical within a child's dialect. So that's first and foremost, that we would not want to penalize that and to have an underrepresentation of a student's true skill. In the Padlet, we have linked to a research brief from OSEP, and it is a really wonderful summary of just general principles for assessment with multilingual and English language learners. With these types of students, the screening piece actually works in our favor, knowing that with students where there are cultural and linguistic diversities, we know that one data point may not be a reliable indicator of that child's true skill. So we can look at more dynamic assessment over time, and that speaks to progress monitoring, which I'm hoping we'll get into in a future webinar, but that idea that we can look at a child's rate of growth and response to instruction, potentially even using a test, teach, retest model. So there is a really great piece that is linked in the Padlet. If anybody is interested in learning more about screening for multilingual learners, I would highly recommend taking a look at that, because it's a very important consideration to be mindful of.
Okay. I think Alicia will jump in with the next question. Okay, maybe she's
sorry.
not.
I am sorry. I just a technical difficulty over here. Yes, so there will there was sort of a follow-up question to that around the cultural responsiveness of screeners. So there's someone who was saying that they had heard that DIBELS wasn't culturally responsive. If anyone wanted to comment on that.
So I will say I don't use DIBELS myself personally, but I do think it is something that we need to make sure we're using that lens for any of the instruction and screening and assessment that we're doing with students. I think that's something to be very mindful of. I think that we want to be mindful of the fact that with these measures being constantly researched and constantly being developed, there are often changes that happen. That's why we're looking at printing out PDFs. So I know in the times that I've been using measures that often I'm reprinting or getting different versions of it. I think the other thing to think about, we had some teachers mention that the importance of using those 3 different probes, knowing that students come with different background knowledges, different vocabulary levels, different experiences, and they bring that to the classroom, and we need to use that and honor that. So the idea that with many screeners, we are looking at using 3 different probes and selecting the median, knowing that way we are hopefully avoiding some potential difficulties in measuring when we're looking at background knowledge or content knowledge or vocabulary. I'm happy, if anybody else wants to jump in with that one, please feel free, but those are my initial thoughts.
All right. We'll proceed to the next question, and that is, in most cases, screening didn't happen in kindergarten, and we have teachers in grade 3, 4, and teachers of older students who are asking, is it too late to start screening in the later grades since no screening was done before?
That's a fantastic question. And it does get to be a little bit more complex. And Lee, feel free to jump in, because I know that, Lee and I have talked about how that idea of the gap between struggling readers in the early years is much more subtle and much more nuanced. And when, they come into Lee's grade 4 classroom, we notice gaps between our strongest readers and our weakest readers. I would not say it's too late. I think that screening will always give that type of reliable indicators. We might need to think about, for students who are older, who are very much struggling, we might need to think of what other additional assessment we might want to layer in. To me, that speaks to the importance of diagnostic assessment, that second column in the chart, knowing that we might need to dig in deeper and to clarify what specific phonics patterns need to be taught. How is this child's vocabulary? Is there a phonemic awareness difficulty? We know that the screener will help us to identify, yes, there is a problem. We also know that we can use that screener for progress monitoring to know whether our instruction is working, but we may need to think about layering in additional tools using professional judgment to help to clarify a student's learning profile and what that intervention should look like.
I think we also want to keep mindful, and I think we've talked about this as well, that we aren't going to necessarily close the gap in that 1 year. I mean, if there are children in grade 4 who've been struggling all along, we might not get them right to benchmark. We might, though, and we absolutely might. We don't want to not try. However, we know that our goal is to really close the gap as much as possible. And so that's something that I sort of struggled with a wee bit last year, because I had a couple of students that were below benchmark and remained below benchmark. However, they got a lot closer to benchmark. And just to be mindful of the goals you set. And so obviously ambitious goals, but being mindful of reasonable goals.
And I think within that, that was a great, just to piggyback off of that, when we're thinking about older students, and especially when we're thinking about using those ORF probes, we can tease out that accuracy versus that fluency. And we know that the fluency piece is a really sticky thing to close the gap for older struggling readers, knowing that these students have had years of reduced reading exposure. They haven't had the opportunity to orthographically map as many words. They are likely still reading sound by sound. So knowing that fluency can be a little bit more challenging to close the gap for, but we still have that separate score of accuracy, and knowing that there's plenty of really significant research that indicates how we can improve the accuracy of even older struggling readers.
Alicia?
Sorry, my usual unmute key combination here isn't working for me today. Sorry about that. So there were a couple of questions about norms and using screening tools that are using typically US norms. So there's someone that mentioned that they were getting some pushback from their board because the screening tools have US norms. There's another person who asked, are there any special considerations if you're using a tool that has US norms? And are there any tools that have Canadian norms?
That is a lot of great questions all bundled up into one. I hope I will remember everything. First off, absolutely. In the Padlet, we have linked to a document. It's called Considerations for Selecting a Screener, and it sort of walks through the steps of how we might want to assess whether a tool could be used representatively for the population that we're in. And really, it is a consideration in terms of where a measure was normed. It absolutely is a consideration. To my knowledge, AimsWeb does have a Canadian version that was normed on a Canadian sample. I don't know whether AimsWeb has benchmark scores or whether that is just percentiles. So that would be something to look into. It's not something I'm aware of. I think the other consideration is that if a data system is being used, very often that data system does provide local norms as well. So you may have a benchmark that you can interpret student performance off of, but then you may also have local norms, which gives an indicator of how that child's performance falls within performance of students within your context, however they define it. So I think that could be an additional consideration for interpreting student scores and for making decisions in terms of what that support looks like. Did I answer everything in that question?
All right. Is the AimsWeb link in the Padlet, Una?
Yes, it is.
Wonderful.
It's Pearson Clinical.
Excellent. So that person could go back to the board and say, we have a Canadian normed tool. And that would be AimsWeb. Thank you. Someone wants to clarify the difference between screening and assessment, because it sounds like the screening tools serve a different purpose than the non-examples, such as Fountas and Pinnell and GB+.
That person is absolutely correct. They do serve different purposes. When we think about how we would select a tool, we're thinking about the question that we're asking, either about students or about a system, and we're thinking about selecting a tool that has the characteristics that allow it to actually answer that question. So if we're wanting to know really quickly who's at risk, who's at risk student-wise, who's at risk system-wise. Unfortunately, the non-examples of those diagnostic assessments we gave, the core phonics survey, fantastic tool, doesn't give us an indicator of who's at risk. Same with those non-examples of running record-based tools. To that person who had that question, please look at the Padlet, because I've linked two really interesting research articles that are open source. There's no paywall, and then also an article on Reading Rockets that shows some of the difficulties in terms of how we really can't trust those data, and they don't allow us to know quickly, reliably, and efficiently and inexpensively who's at risk, so we can adjust the instructional context.
Thanks. I'm going to jump in with another question, and then we have a special question to end with. So there was a lot of chatter and a lot of questions about the PAST assessment, David Kilpatrick's PAST assessment. So a lot of school boards are using that as their screener. So I was wondering if you could speak about the PAST, explain what it is for people who aren't familiar with it, and then explain how is that different than the screeners that you're talking about, or how does that fit in like a fuller screening, more full screening program?
So the PAST, sometimes it can be really challenging. And Nelly, you and I have chatted a lot about this. It's something that sometimes there's the word screener in the name, and it doesn't actually mean it's a screener in the way that we're using that word screener right now. So the PAST is is an adapted version of a tool. It was adapted by Dr. David Kilpatrick. It goes along with the phonemic awareness intervention program, Equipped for Reading Success. It is found for free on the internet. It is a phenomenal tool. I use it. I don't know. I wouldn't personally consider using it as a universal screening tool with everybody, just knowing, again, we don't have we have neither norms nor a benchmark. We're not able to really quickly assess risk. It does take some time to complete. There is sort of a fast track version, but we're not looking at a really quick 1 minute indicator. For me, the purpose of this really dovetails nicely with that idea of a diagnostic assessment, that we might use that for students where we're noticing concern, either on a PSF, a phoneme segmentation fluency screener measure, or perhaps a nonsense word fluency measure. That might be something where we might select, especially thinking about that earlier question of what to do with older struggling readers. That might be an interesting situation to pull out the PAST and get a sense of what phonemic skills might need intervention.
Thanks. And then we had another question that came through the chat, and I have elevated this person to a panelist so they can ask the question themselves. So are you able to, I've just added you, are you able to turn your camera on now? Unmute. See if this goes.
You'll have to make them a co-host, Alicia.
I don't think I can, actually. I think only you have the ability to do that. Can you do that, Melinda?
I see somebody. I see a name popping up. I don't know whether we can do.
Well, you can speak. Can you ask your question?
Yes. Hi, Una. It's Miss Van, your old grade 2 teacher. You will be happy to know that at your old elementary school, we have been doing screening for quite a long time, over 10 years. We started with Dibbles and we've switched over to Easy CBM. And I have been doing learning strategies, which is literacy intervention, for the past 18 years, taking kids out and working with them. I would like to know if there is a screener that you know of that I could use with our JKs, because unlike in the public schools, JK and SK are 2 separate programs. And I want to know if there's anything out there that you know of that I could use with the JKs.
Well, first off, what a really awesome surprise. I feel like that might be why this person gets elevated to a co-host. I actually have a really great answer. Acadians has, I wish I had it at my fingertips or I would show it to you, but I'll send you an email. I'll track down your email address. Acadians has one. It's called Pre-K, knowing again, it's from an American context that their Pre-K would be our year 1 kindergarten. But it's called PELI, Preschool Early Literacy Indicators. It is not free online the way the rest of the Acadians measures are, but it's beautiful. And it's one of my favorite screeners to do because it's embedded within a picture book. So it taps vocabulary, oral language, comprehension, alphabet knowledge, and phonological awareness. And for example, it's embedded within a picture book. So we would sit side by side with the child and, there's a bowl of alphabet soup in the story. And, the child has to identify the letters that they recognize in the alphabet soup, which I think, again, really points to that idea of screening is not this horrible, awful thing that feels terrible for kids. It's as easy as reading a picture book. But to my knowledge, I think that's one of the few screeners. I don't think Dibbles 8 has one. And again, knowing that a lot of those K ones start with what would be our year 2. PELI would be my best bet.
Thank you, Una. Hold on.
you.
I've just got an invitation to be a panelist here. Open. I don't know what I'm doing on my new laptop. No, I don't know. Anyways, that sounds like a great place to start. And I'm sure I can look into that and start screening our JKs, which would be great to see sort of where they're at right at the beginning of the year. And if there's anybody who needs to be on my radar.
Because I think that's something there is sometimes, and I'm mindful of the time, but there is a really common concern about should we be screening students in their first year of school, knowing we haven't taught them anything yet? And that answer is even more so yes, knowing that we're not assessing mastery, we're not assessing content knowledge in terms of how they've done with instruction, we're assessing risk. And we need to know pretty quickly, are they at risk? And certainly with young students, we want to look at that language piece as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Una. 2 more quick questions. We might be going over the time just a little bit, but hang on, everyone, because we're doing the draw for 2 foundations manuals from the University of Florida Literacy Institute, and it's an excellent manual. One very special, important question is, do we provide screeners in French immersion in the first language or in the second language?
That's a good question. And I would love for either of our 2 French teachers to jump in on this if they have strong feelings. It's something where, we do know that a lot of language is cross-linguistic, and that's a key consideration. There is more research on this in, certainly with Spanish-speaking bilinguals, with English language learning research in the US. And I think that really gives an indicator that there's stuff that there's predictive value with either language or both languages. But I think that a lot of that consideration really might stem from the specific model in terms of when immersion is started and when English is started. And I would hesitate to say something blanket, knowing that different languages are integrated at different times and it might vary based on model, would be my non-answer. Lee and Nelly, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree. Oh, sorry, Nelly, I cut you off there. 100%. I mean, we start, and I don't know about you, Nelly, but we start in grade 1 now. And so it would be unrealistic to ask students to give letter names, for example, in French when we've not necessarily taught them at the start of the year. And so, however, you could still ask students to do things in their first language. So there's a bit of a time, I think, when you are still screening in English, and middle year you could start probably considering both. Even I think, Nelly, you've mentioned using both.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's an incredible question, and one that Una and I have discussed as well. And from what I understand, there isn't a really clear answer in terms of research available where this is concerned. But for my purposes, because they're in grade 2 and they've already had a couple of years of French instruction, I screen them in French and then do an English screening, on a case-by-case basis where I'm looking for more information or where the picture's really blurry and just wanting to see what's happening in their first language. I hope that's helpful.
That is helpful. Thank you. And Kate saw a question and would like to address it. And after that, we'll conclude.
Sure, thank you. I just saw somebody asking about the role of the early childhood educator with all of this in the classroom. So just really quickly, yes, they are partners with the teachers here in Ontario. I know, like in my class, with my background with this now and the fact that I've had a lot of turnover with my partnership, I do take the lead on it in my class. But I know at PVNC in the spring, we had a science of reading book club, and we had tons of ECEs participate. Because teachers didn't learn this when we were trained, some of those ECEs probably, were on a quicker path than some of their teaching partners at that point. We're going to have literacy coaches in the class who will be working with the teacher and the ECE. So absolutely, those ECEs are fully qualified to help with this screening process, and it should be a team thing going on in kindergarten. And that was a great question. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Kate. So we want to thank Una and Kate and Nelly and Lee for your generosity in giving your time and expertise this evening. You have clearly demystified early screening and shown how easy and beneficial this can be in preventing reading problems with our students. As Louisa Motes says, reading problems are preventable for 95% of children. So this early screening is a very important tool. Una, would you like to tell us who are the winners of the Foundations manuals?
I would love to, especially because this UFly resource has been so hotly anticipated and it's hard to get and the shipping is expensive. So we are happy to announce that Nancy from Simcoe County and Nicola from Waterloo Region are both winners of 2 UFly Foundations manuals. And we will email you to set up the logistics of that. But we are so thankful to everybody who participated, and congratulations to those 2, because you will have a phenomenal phonics manual to use when it arrives.
Great. And so we have some upcoming webinars that we would love to have you participate in. Our next one is September 14th. Martha Kovac will be presenting a 90-minute block in structured literacy, and with all the resources, the lesson planning, an example, many free resources. So you are welcome to attend that. It's also free and will be recorded. Also consider joining us for the Right to Read inquiry, Responding to Opposition, which Una will present on September 21st. And of course, we would love it if you could join us for the 2nd and 3rd sessions of Becoming a Literacy Leader, which will be October 26th and November 30th. Also, please consider becoming a volunteer with IDA Ontario. You can join us at idaontario.com at the link that we're showing right now. And none of this can happen without your donations. We have to pay for a lot of administrative costs because of Zoom and the YouTube channel and many, many other things. And we have no provincial or federal funding whatsoever. We rely on your donations. We don't charge for our webinars any longer. The workshops probably not either, because we want everyone to be having the knowledge that is necessary for us to implement the changes that are being outlined in the Right to Read Inquiry Report. We think they are essential and so vital for all of our children. And so if you can make a donation, we'd really appreciate it. So without further ado, thank you again for attending this evening. We really appreciate your participation, and we hope to see you very soon. Good night.